The discovery was not loud, nor did it come with the grand fanfare that often surrounds the unearthing of ancient treasures. It began in silence, deep beneath layers of forgotten soil, where time itself had built walls of dust around secrets no one was meant to see. The team of researchers did not expect much that day, just another survey, another excavation in a site long dismissed as ordinary. But when the earth gave way to the edge of a carved surface and a faint shimmer of something sacred caught the dim light of their lamps, everything changed. What they had uncovered was not merely an artifact, but the beginning of a story deliberately hidden for 2,500 years. The object lay in fragments, yet even broken it carried a presence that pressed heavily upon the air. Intricate markings danced across its surface, not random, not decorative, but purposeful like coded whispers etched into stone and metal. The silence of the chamber seemed almost alive, as if the very walls were reluctant to let the outside world hear what had just been revealed. One of the archaeologists brushed away centuries of dirt, only to pull back his hand as though the markings themselves carried heat. This was not ordinary history. It felt as if something sacred had been placed here with intention, shielded by time, and now, by accident or destiny, it had resurfaced. The first glance revealed symbols not yet understood, spirals, stars, and lines converging into shapes that seemed both human and divine. The researchers exchanged uncertain glances, their rational minds warring with a growing sense of unease. They were trained to analyze, to interpret, to remain detached, yet here, in the cold silence of the earth, detachment seemed impossible. There was a weight, an invisible gravity pulling them toward the realization that what they had stumbled upon was never meant to be seen casually. These artifacts, sacred in their design, seemed less like relics of the past and more like deliberate messages sealed by hands that claimed to speak for gods. As the hours passed and more pieces were lifted from the soil, the chamber seemed to breathe. Dust particles floated in the artificial light, moving like spectral guardians disturbed from their eternal watch. Every artifact carried a similar motif, as though a single voice had spoken through different mediums: clay, bronze, and stone, all aligned with a singular purpose. And behind each line, each carved symbol, there was the echo of intention: to preserve, to warn, to survive the erosion of time itself. It became clear to the team that this was not treasure. This was testimony. But testimony of what? The artifacts did not glitter with jewels, nor did they serve as offerings of devotion. Instead, they bore an atmosphere of secrecy, a silence that bordered on resistance. What was uncovered that day was not a gift, it was a threshold, a doorway into knowledge long suppressed, knowledge that carried with it not only the weight of history, but the shadow of a warning. The question lingered unspoken among the team, heavy as the dust in their lungs. Were they the chosen ones to rediscover what had been hidden, or had they simply awakened a secret the gods had once buried to protect mankind from itself? The deeper they ventured into the chamber, the more undeniable the truth became. This was no random deposit of ancient objects, no accidental burial by the erosion of centuries. The arrangement of the artifacts was deliberate, careful, almost ritualistic. Each fragment rested as though placed by hands that knew exactly where it should remain for eternity. The space itself seemed less like a tomb and more like a shrine, one not dedicated to worship, but to secrecy. And secrecy, in this context, meant danger. The markings across the artifacts hinted at a worldview long erased from memory. They spoke of gods not as distant creators, but as custodians of knowledge too perilous for ordinary men. Ancient societies often placed their trust in symbols, but here the symbols were not just decorative. They were maps, codes, perhaps even warnings. Lines of script wound around the edges like serpents guarding sacred ground, intersecting with symbols of fire, water, and celestial alignments. This was a language of eternity, designed not to be read easily, but to survive the erosion of human memory until the moment it was most needed or most feared. The lead researcher noted one recurring motif, a spiral enclosing an eye encircled again by flames. In cultures across the world, spirals represented cycles, birth, death, and rebirth. The eye, however, was universal. The eye of watchfulness, the eye of judgment, the eye that sees beyond. And the flames surrounding it were no mere ornament. They were purification, destruction, renewal. It was a symbol of gods who not only created but also punished, gods who gave knowledge but demanded obedience. Such imagery was not designed to inspire comfort. It was meant to remind anyone who looked upon it of a balance that could never be broken without consequence. But what unsettled the team most was not the symbols themselves, but the realization that the people who carved them must have done so in full awareness of an approaching doom. These were not celebratory relics, no trophies of conquest or prosperity. They were fragments of a message, an urgent attempt to encode something that could not be spoken aloud. Why would a civilization channel its last efforts into warnings carved into sacred artifacts unless they believed the danger would outlive them? The silence of the chamber pressed harder now, no longer passive but heavy, like a hand gripping the air. Each step further into the space felt like a trespass, each photograph taken like a theft. The gods, whoever they were, had hidden these secrets for a reason. And the deeper the researchers looked, the stronger grew the sense that some knowledge was never meant to be unearthed. The question formed slowly in the minds of the team, though none dared voice it. Had they uncovered the remains of a faith or the remnants of a curse? And if these artifacts were indeed left behind by those who communed with the gods, then the message they carried was not only sacred, it was dire. The first night after the discovery was restless. The team gathered in their temporary camp, but their conversations carried a strange unease, as though the weight of the chamber still clung to them. The photographs of the artifacts sat on the table, illuminated by the cold glow of laptops, their symbols staring back like eyes refusing to close. Even the simplest carving seemed to move when watched too long, as if meaning pulsed beneath the surface, waiting for someone to understand. No one said it aloud, but all felt it. They had crossed a threshold. The next morning, the excavation resumed. With careful hands, more earth was cleared, and soon the chamber widened into a second space, its walls lined with stone slabs arranged in eerie precision. There, embedded within the soil, the team uncovered not just artifacts but a structure, a circular altar, blackened as though scorched by fire. Around it, fragments of vessels lay scattered, each inscribed with the same recurring spiral eye motif. The air grew colder as they worked, a chill not explained by depth or lack of light. It was the kind of cold that seemed to come from within, from the presence of something that did not belong. As they brushed away layers of dirt from the altar, an unsettling detail emerged. The stones were stained dark, not by time alone, but by something absorbed deeply into their pores. Tests would later confirm traces of organic matter, but in that moment, all the researchers saw was the unmistakable impression of ritual. This was no place of passive worship. It was a site of offerings, perhaps sacrifices, left to appease the very forces the artifacts spoke of. The gods, it seemed, had demanded more than prayers. They had demanded blood. Whispers filled the chamber as the team debated the meaning. Some argued for caution, suggesting the items be sealed and left for later analysis in the safety of a controlled environment. Others pushed forward, unable to resist the lure of discovery. Every hesitation was matched by a pull, as though the artifacts themselves refused to remain buried any longer. One researcher noted how the spiral motif always faced inward toward the altar's center. "It's a containment," he suggested quietly, "a way to lock something in." His words hung in the cold air, heavy with implications none wanted to acknowledge. By the end of the day, they had unearthed a complete tablet, remarkably intact, its surface covered in script. Though no one could yet decipher it, the arrangement of the lines carried the rhythm of warning. Not a story, not a chronicle, but a command. and standing over it, with dust still clinging to their clothes, the researchers felt the same question press into their thoughts once more. Had they uncovered knowledge preserved for them, or a seal broken that was never meant to open? The chamber no longer felt like a place of discovery. It felt like a place of awakening. And awakenings, in the language of forgotten gods, rarely came without consequence. The tablet was carried out of the chamber with reverence, but the weight of its presence seemed to follow even beyond the excavation site. Once cleaned and illuminated under controlled light, the carvings revealed a level of detail no one had expected. The gods, or whatever forces were represented here, had not been portrayed as benevolent guardians. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were elongated, abstract, more symbolic than human. Some had multiple eyes etched across their foreheads. Others bore wings that melted into flames, as if divinity itself were indistinguishable from fire. Each figure was framed by spirals, circles, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse like energy frozen in stone. At the center of nearly every depiction, however, one motif dominated: the spiral eye encircled by fire. It was more than an emblem, it was a proclamation. The gods were not silent observers. They were watchful, burning, relentless. To the ancient carvers, these images were not art but law, a declaration carved so deeply that time itself could not erase it. The eye was always watching. The flame was always consuming. The spiral was always turning, drawing all life into its inevitable cycle. Interpretations within the team varied. One scholar suggested that the imagery spoke of cosmic guardianship, a reminder that the divine kept order across heaven and earth. Another disagreed, arguing that the flames symbolized punishment, the consequence of breaking forbidden's boundaries. "This is not protective," she whispered, tracing the lines with her finger. "It's a sentence." Their arguments did not resolve. Instead, they fueled the sense that the artifacts carried dual meanings, as though intentionally designed to conceal as much as they revealed. More troubling still were the smaller symbols surrounding the larger figures. Stars, constellations, and eclipses were etched with astonishing accuracy, mapping celestial events that had occurred thousands of years ago. One sequence seemed to portray a rare alignment of planets, followed immediately by the carving of waves engulfing entire structures. Another showed a fiery object descending from the sky, splitting the spiral into fragments. It was impossible not to see these as records of disaster cosmic warnings encoded into sacred form. The artifacts did not merely portray gods as rulers. They portrayed gods as arbiters of fate. To disobey them, or even to misunderstand them, was to invite calamity. The message was unmistakable. Humanity had once been warned, and that warning had been engraved into stone, into metal, into the very soul of a civilization that vanished not long after. As the researchers cataloged each piece, an unspoken dread spread among them. These were not relics of devotion but instruments of memory, tools meant to carry the voice of the divine across ages. If the gods had hidden these artifacts, they had done so not to preserve their glory, but to ensure their warnings remained untouched until the appointed time. And if that time had now arrived, then perhaps uncovering them was not an achievement, but an omen already fulfilled. The first translations of the tablet came slowly, piece by piece, but the fragments that emerged were enough to unsettle even the most skeptical minds. The script did not read like myth or prayer. It spoke in declarations, stark and absolute, with no space for interpretation. The eye will not close. The fire will descend. The spiral will return. These were not metaphors wrapped in poetic form. They were instructions, almost commands, carved as though meant to echo across centuries. A linguist working through the night identified what seemed to be a sequence, a description of celestial alignments, followed by devastation on earth. One passage described the sky darkening while the waters rose to swallow lands. Another spoke of the sun bleeding fire, scorching harvests until the fields of men lay barren. And then came the most chilling line of all. When the spiral opens again, mankind will stand before the judgment of the gods. The chamber, it seemed, had not been a temple of worship, but a vault of prophecy. The omen was unmistakable. The artifacts were not simply relics of a forgotten belief system. They were warnings encoded for future generations. The gods, or the priests who spoke in their name, had left behind a record of a cycle catastrophe that struck when certain signs aligned in the heavens. And according to preliminary astronomical comparisons, those very alignments were not relics of the past. They were approaching again. The realization spread uneasily through the team. It was one thing to examine myth. It was another to stare at stone records that matched pattern science could still verify. Were these the fearful imaginings of a civilization that collapsed under its own weight? Or had they truly witnessed cycles of destruction too vast for modern memory to contain? The silence around the artifacts now carried a pulse of dread, as if the chamber itself had released something more than knowledge, a reminder that humanity's place under the stars was fragile. Contingent always watched. The team lead, usually cautious, voiced what no one wanted to say aloud. If they were right, if this was their warning, then it was meant for us. The words hung heavy, unchallenged, because deep down each of them had felt it. The carvings were not only echoes of a dead civilization. They were a mirror showing a humanity still walking blindly toward the same spiral. What made the omen even more unnerving was the tone in which it had been carved. There was no plea for mercy, no appeal for forgiveness, no hope offered. The message was delivered with the cold certainty of law. Cycles repeat, judgment returns, and man cannot escape. This was not prophecy as comfort. It was prophecy as inevitability. And as the final lines were deciphered, an image formed that none could shake. A spiral burning in the sky, an eye that never closed, and mankind standing once more at the edge of its own end. The records carved into the artifacts did not end with prophecy alone. Among the fragments, there were depictions of turmoil signs, that the very civilization which produced these sacred warnings had been consumed by the events they feared. On the walls of the chamber and the edges of the tablets, scenes unfolded like a slow descent into chaos. Crops withering, rivers overflowing, structures collapsing under the weight of fire and water. These were not symbolic decorations. They were chronicles carved by witnesses who had watched their world unravel. Archaeological layers around the site confirmed what the carvings suggested. Sediment samples revealed traces of ash mingled with silt, evidence of both fire and flood. The soil bore scars of violent disruption, sudden and catastrophic, rather than the gradual erosion of centuries. It was as if the land itself had turned against its people, striking in waves of destruction that left little room for survival. The civilization that had once honored the gods with sacred artifacts did not vanish quietly. It fell under the weight of calamity, just as their own warnings had predicted. And yet, there was something even more unsettling in the record. The carvings suggested that the disaster had not been natural alone. Scenes showed people fleeing not just the elements, but one another. Figures etched with raised weapons stood beside symbols of fire, as if human hands had joined the destruction. Fear, perhaps, had driven them into conflict. Or perhaps, as the inscriptions implied, the gods had unleashed judgment not only through the skies, but through the unraveling of human bonds. A society already weakened by distrust collapsed entirely when the omens arrived. What haunted the researchers most was the realization that no trace of continuity followed this collapse. Unlike other cultures that evolved, migrated, or left remnants in later societies, this one seemed to have been erased. Its language disappeared, its rituals extinguished, its memory buried with the very artifacts now unearthed. Only the warnings endured, sealed in chambers that were never meant to be disturbed until a distant age. The civilization had lived, feared, and perished, all within the cycle they themselves had tried to mark. The parallel was unavoidable. If their prophecy had ended in their destruction, then uncovering it now carried a shadow of repetition. History had not simply forgotten them, it had preserved their downfall as a mirror, a message etched in the bones of the earth. And if the same celestial alignments were returning in the present age, then perhaps the fate that consumed them was not theirs alone, but part of a pattern written into the fabric of time. The chamber that had once been a sanctuary of secrets now stood as a tomb, not just for a people, but for a warning ignored. The fall of that civilization was not an ending sealed in the past. It was a grim reminder of what might yet return, waiting for humanity to walk the same path once more. The further the translations progressed, the more difficult it became to dismiss the sense of connection between the ancient words and the present day. The omens carved 2,500 years ago no longer felt like the memory of a civilization long gone. They began to read like reflections of our own fragile world. When the inscription spoke of rivers rising and swallowing lands, it was impossible not to think of coastlines today eroded by relentless floods, storms, and rising seas. When they warned of fire consuming the harvests, how could one ignore the devastating wildfires and failing crops already threatening the stability of nations? The spiral of cycles seemed to extend beyond the past, weaving itself into the fabric of our time. For centuries, historians had dismissed prophecies as superstition, the language of fear from people unable to explain natural phenomena. But these artifacts resisted that reduction. The precision of their celestial depictions, the accuracy of their environmental descriptions, all suggested that the ancients had witnessed something cyclical, something real, and that they had taken great pains to ensure their descendants would not forget. And yet, humanity had forgotten until now, when the patterns began to repeat with eerie familiarity. In the camp, conversations grew darker. "Look at this line," one researcher said, pointing to the tablet. "It speaks of men fighting men when the spiral opened." Another added, "We are already there, wars, conflict, division everywhere. Doesn't it sound like the same unraveling?" Each comparison deepened the unease. The warnings did not only describe environmental catastrophe, they described social fracture trust dissolving, violence spreading, communities collapsing into fear. The parallels with modern headlines were difficult to ignore. The most unsettling passage described the world standing before the eye that does not close. Interpreted as divine judgment in the ancient world, it now carried a double meaning. Was the eye a cosmic force, or a metaphor for human awareness, an unblinking truth that sees through illusion and denial? The artifacts seemed to suggest that once the cycle began, there was no turning away. Humanity would be forced to face its reflection, whether through gods, nature, or conscience. The modern parallels only amplified the gravity of the discovery. Rising seas, burning forests, endless wars, and a human race divided by greed and fear. It was as though the prophecy was not about a distant age at all, but about the present moment, unfolding step by step. The gods had not been silent. Their warnings had been carved into eternity. It was humanity that had refused to listen. And now, with the spiral once again turning, the question became inescapable. Was this generation destined to repeat the same fate? Or had the rediscovery of these artifacts come as a final chance, a moment to break the cycle before the eye in the fire returned once more? As the translations deepened, a new layer of meaning began to emerge, one not written in explicit warnings of fire or flood, but in the subtle patterns woven between the symbols. Some of the inscriptions did not describe external disasters at all. Instead, they spoke of the inner state of mankind, the blindness of the heart, the corruption of the spirit, and the silence that comes when humanity turns away from the voice within. It was as if the artifacts were not only forecasting natural calamity, but also describing the unraveling of human consciousness itself. The spiral, once interpreted as a cosmic cycle, now revealed another face. In several passages, it was linked to the path of the soul, a descent and return, a movement outward into illusion and inward into truth. The eye, too, was given dual meaning. It was not only the eye of the gods that watched men, it was the eye inside men that had closed. When the eye within is blind, one fragment read, the fire comes not from heaven, but from man's own hand. Suddenly, the carvings were no longer just warnings of divine judgment. They were a mirror pointing to humanity's inner state as the true cause of collapse. The researchers found themselves torn. Some argued for a purely historical reading. The ancients had sought to encode spiritual philosophy alongside their prophecies. But others sensed something more alive in the words, as though they had been waiting to be read at this exact time. What if the gods were not only speaking of the sky, one scholar asked, but of us? What if the dire omen is not about what falls upon us, but what we have already become? The silence that followed was heavier than any argument, for deep down, each felt the resonance of the thought. What if the ancient civilization had fallen not only because of external calamity, but because they had lost themselves inwardly? What if the true spiral was the cycle of forgetting, of turning away from the inner voice until destruction was inevitable? The more the inscriptions were studied, the clearer this possibility became. The outer disasters mirrored inner ones. The fire outside was the fire of greed, violence, and desire. The flood outside was the flood of fear and despair. The gods had carved not only what would happen in the heavens, but what would happen in the human soul if it ceased to listen. It was this dual meaning that unsettled the team most. For if the spiral and the eye were inner as well as outer, then the prophecy was not only about ancient people or modern disasters. It was about everyone, at every time, whenever the inner eye closed and the inner spiral was forgotten. And in that moment, the artifacts ceased to be ancient relics. They became immediate, intimate, unavoidable. They were no longer warnings carved for humanity in general. They were warnings carved for the listener, here and now. The more the artifacts were studied, the more unsettling became the parallels with the present moment. The spiral, once thought of as an abstract motif, was traced against astronomical charts and revealed alignments eerily similar to events unfolding in today's skies. Conjunctions of planets, eclipses, and celestial movements described in the carvings were no longer relics of a forgotten past, they were happening again right now. The cycle had returned, and with it came the same tremors of fear that had haunted a civilization 2,500 years ago. But it was not only the heavens that seemed to echo the prophecy. Across the earth, the signs multiplied. Seas swelling beyond their shores, fires consuming entire landscapes, cities trembling under floods and storms. These were not distant events, confined to mythic imagination. They were news headlines, lived realities. The omens carved into sacred artifacts had crossed the barrier of time, unfolding again with terrifying precision. The ancient warnings had ceased to be archaeology. They had become prophecy alive. More disturbing still was the reflection in humanity itself. Just as the inscriptions described, division grew sharper, distrust deepened, and violence spread like fire in dry grass. The spiral of inner blindness, the closing of the inner eye, was no longer an abstract idea. It was visible in the way nations fractured, communities dissolved, and individuals turned away from one another. The gods had warned that destruction came when humanity forgot its own center, and everywhere the forgetting was visible. The dire omen was not only in the storms and flames of the earth, but in the storms and flames within the human heart. The team of researchers, once objective, now found themselves haunted. Their work was no longer detached study. It had become a mirror they could not escape. Every inscription seemed to whisper directly into their lives. The cycle has returned. The eye is watching. The fire is near. Some began to dream of spirals, of skies burning, of voices they could not identify calling their names from within the earth. It was as though contact with the artifacts had awakened something in them, an awareness they had not sought, but could no longer silence. And yet, one truth remained clear. The artifacts had not survived the erosion of millennia only to terrify. They had survived to remind. They had resurfaced at this exact moment, not randomly, but because the cycle demanded it. Humanity was once again standing before the same threshold, staring into the same unblinking eye, hearing the same silence of gods who warn without pleading. The dire omen had returned not as a distant tale of what once was, but as the present reality of what is unfolding now. The Chamber of Secrets was no longer just beneath the ground. It had risen into the world, into the skies, into the pulse of human life. And before its message, there was no neutrality left. Either the warning would be heeded, or the spiral would consume again, as it always had. The artifacts now rest in the hands of curators and researchers, displayed under controlled lights, cataloged in databases, studied with the precision of science. Yet no glass case or academic paper can silence the weight they carry. They are not simply objects of history, they are voices that survive the collapse of a world. Voices speaking still, their words etched in stone not to preserve beauty, but to deliver warning. And the warning is not confined to the past. It looks forward. It looks here. It looks now. In their silence, the gods do not beg, they do not comfort, and they do not soften their message. The spiral turns regardless of human desire. The eye remains open whether we acknowledge it or not, and the fire waits, patient and unrelenting. The civilization that once carved these warnings thought they could endure, thought they were eternal. Yet they were erased, leaving behind only fragments of stone. What they tried to preserve was not their glory, but their failure so that others might not repeat it. And yet, here we stand, on the edge of the same spiral, repeating the same blindness. Perhaps the most haunting truth is that the gods did not need to hide their warnings. They placed them in plain sight in the stars above, in the patterns of nature, in the cycles of life and death that unfold before every human eye. The artifacts are not secrets in themselves. They are reminders that the world has always spoken, that the signs have always been present, and that humanity has always chosen to look away. The dire omen was not carved to terrify. It was carved to awaken. And so the story closes not with certainty, but with a choice. The researchers may continue their studies, the public may marvel at the relics, but the true weight of the discovery does not rest in museums or in books. It rests in the hearts of those who hear the echo of the warning and ask themselves what it means. Will we listen this time? Or will we, like the ancients, close the inner eye, ignore the spiral, and walk willingly into fire? The chamber beneath the earth has been emptied, but the greater chamber lies within each soul. There, the carvings are not made of stone, but of choices. There, the warnings are not written in ancient languages, but in the whispers of conscience, in the silence of reflection, in the unblinking gaze of truth. And there, perhaps, lies the only way the spiral can be broken. For now, the gods remain silent. But their silence is not absence, it is waiting. Waiting to see if mankind will finally remember what was once forgotten, or if we will again fall beneath the weight of a prophecy that was never meant to be ignored. The spiral has opened. The eye is watching. The question remains, what will humanity do with this truth?